She entered the mansion quietly, just as she did every morning. Her steps were steady, her gaze weary, her hands calloused. Everything about her screamed dignity, even though life had never been kind. But that day something felt different. A door left ajar, a golden glow slipping through the cracks, and a silence, almost intentional. It was as if fate itself was testing the last fragment of her soul. What would she do now? No one was watching. No one, except for a hidden camera. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can keep being moved every day by new inspiring and emotional stories. Mr. Wallace was a man who seemed to have it all. Mansions, luxury cars, shares in powerful companies, and a respected name in the business world. But what no one saw was that behind every achievement, there was a deep trace of loneliness and distrust. He had built his empire brick by brick after being rejected by his own family when he decided to give up everything to carve his own path. He had seen friends betray him, employees steal from him, and even his ex-wife leave him on his birthday, taking not only her affection but also half of his fortune. Since then, Wallace had decided he would never trust anyone without testing them first. Every person in his life was, to him, a potential traitor in disguise. It wasn't irrational paranoia, it was the result of wounds too raw to ever heal. That's why, when he learned that the new cleaning lady would start that week, he had an extra camera installed in his private office and deliberately left a spare key under the entryway rug. He was ready for another test. After all, how can you trust someone who needs the money you have in excess? Clara, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of Wallace. Simple, discreet, and deeply marked by loss, she didn't ask much from life beyond dignity and peace. Coming from a tough childhood in the countryside, she learned from her mother to clean with care, speak with kindness, and never touch what didn't belong to her. She married young, lost her husband early, and raised 2 children with what she had in her hands: strength and faith. Every house she worked in was treated as if it were her own, and her greatest pride was leaving without anyone noticing she had even been there. Such was her discretion. When she accepted the job at the Wallace mansion, she had no idea she would be watched or that she would be part of a test. For her, it was just another chance to put food on the table, buy her daughter's medicine, and maybe save a little to fix the washing machine that had been broken for 2 months. She woke up at 5, took 2 buses, and crossed the city with a determination few people noticed. Clara was one of those invisible people whose greatness lives in the details and who only shines in the eyes of those who truly know how to see. That Tuesday morning, Clara arrived a few minutes earlier than usual. The sky was still somewhat dark, and the air carried that fresh crispness typical of early autumn. The mansion was silent, as always, and she entered through the side door with the key she had received on her first day. She took off her shoes as she stepped in, out of respect for the gleaming floors, and headed to the laundry room, where she left her bag and put on her navy blue uniform. But as she passed through the main hallway, something caught her attention. The door to her boss's office, which had always been locked, was slightly ajar. She stopped. Her heart beat faster. Her first instinct was to turn and continue on her way. But something inside her, perhaps a sense of responsibility, perhaps a strange curiosity, made her approach slowly. She touched the doorknob with the tip of her fingers, hesitant. The interior of the room seemed bathed in a soft, golden light that came from inside a safe, completely open. Inside, stacks of money, watches, shining gemstones. Clara felt the world stop for a moment. No one in sight, no sound, no living soul nearby. Just her and an opportunity that, to many, might seem like a blessing. But to Clara, it was something else, a moral abyss. And she knew that, from that moment on, every move she made would carry a weight no one would ever forget. Clara stood still for moments that felt suspended in time. The hallway seemed longer, the walls more silent, and the air heavier. In front of that slightly open door, there was something that went beyond curiosity. It was as if the universe were offering her a disguised trap in the form of a chance. The open safe wasn't just a symbol of material temptation, but an internal mirror, reflecting all the needs, pains, and desires she had locked away in her heart for years. She remembered the nights she pretended not to be hungry so her children could eat. The times she smiled at the grocery store, even knowing her card might not go through. The disappointed look on her son's face when he saw another child's bicycle last Christmas. It was all so real, so present. The safe seemed to whisper those memories, as if saying, "You deserve this." But Clara also remembered her grandmother, a strict woman who had taught her that poverty never justified the loss of honor. That character was the last possession a poor person could afford to lose, because once it was gone, not all the gold in the world could bring it back. She took a deep breath, fought the lump in her throat, and forced herself to step back. She nudged the rug into place with the tip of her foot, slowly, like someone covering a wound they no longer want to see, and with the dignity of someone who chooses what is right even in the dark. She turned her back on it all and returned to her path. Upstairs, behind a security monitor hidden behind expensive books, Wallace observed her every move. His eyes were narrowed, not out of contempt, but from the involuntary effort of trying to understand what he had just witnessed. The plan was simple: stage an easy access situation and record the behavior of someone supposedly ordinary. He wanted to confirm once more what he had always believed, that when no one is watching, people reveal their true intentions. But Clara didn't follow the script. She didn't hesitate out of weakness, but out of humanity. She didn't resist the impulse out of fear of being caught, but because of principles that couldn't be negotiated. Wallace was frozen, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: surprise. But it was more than that. It was a strange discomfort, as if the foundations of his beliefs had been slightly shaken. For the first time in years, he saw someone choose virtue without witnesses, without visible cameras, without promised rewards. He saw purity in its raw state, and it confronted him. There, in front of that screen, Wallace realized that perhaps he had been so surrounded by distrust that he had become incapable of recognizing goodness when it appeared before him, simple, silent, without fanfare. He leaned back in his chair, rested his chin on his hand, and without noticing, sighed. Clara wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was a living reminder of something he, with all his millions, had forgotten: the value of the invisible. Meanwhile, Clara continued her routine with the same serenity as always. She cleaned the mirrors with delicate motions, dusted the picture frames with care, and treated the house's objects with an almost religious reverence. Not because they were expensive, but because they belonged to someone. She always believed that how you care for what isn't yours reveals more about a person than any resume. As she scrubbed the kitchen floor, she thought about the rice she needed to buy, her oldest son's new socks, and the hope of receiving a food basket at the end of the month. Her life was made of these simple fragments, yet full of struggle. And still, there was a peace in her that didn't depend on material achievements. She didn't know she was being watched, nor could she imagine that her actions had made any impact. She was used to invisibility, to the absence of recognition, and had learned to expect nothing beyond what was necessary. Yet still, she did everything with excellence. Because for Clara, integrity wasn't a performance, it was essence. It wasn't about what she did when people were watching. It was about what she did when only God was watching. And in that moment, as she rinsed the cloth in the warm water of the bucket, she smiled to herself. Not because she had turned down a fortune, but because she knew she had won a battle no one would ever applaud. And even so, it was enough. Wallace couldn't escape the unease that had taken hold of him from the moment he saw Clara silently turn away from something that anyone else, in the same situation, might have taken for themselves. It was as if, with a single restrained gesture, she had torn down the walls he had spent decades building around his own heart. He paced back and forth in the office, hands clasped behind his back, like someone revisiting the hallways of their own soul. He recalled every betrayal he had endured. The business partner who sold him out for a bigger share, the childhood friend who took advantage of his trust to embezzle money, the wife who left without looking back, leaving a crack in his soul so deep that he never again allowed another woman to get truly close. He had learned the hard way that trust was the quickest route to downfall. So he turned distrust into a shield, coldness into habit, and loneliness into protection. But now, faced with the image of a woman closing a safe with the same care one uses to close a wound, he felt his internal structure tremble. This wasn't strategy nor manipulation, it was character. And perhaps it was the first time Wallace realized he wasn't prepared to recognize true goodness when it appeared. Clara, with her simplicity and integrity, hadn't just surprised him. She had exposed an absence he didn't even know existed within himself. The next morning, Wallace's mind was overtaken by something he couldn't name. It wasn't guilt. He had long grown used to living with hard decisions, but it was discomfort. It was as if Clara, by acting with integrity, had shown him a reflection of himself, and he didn't like what he saw. He decided to arrive early at the office. He sat in front of the security cameras like a man rewatching the replay of a personal trial. He reviewed the footage dozens of times. Every second was a silent reminder that there was a greatness there that he did not possess. He zoomed in, searching for flaws, hesitations, any evidence of doubt or calculation on her face. But all he saw was naturalness. Clara didn't seem to be making a difficult choice. She was simply being who she was, and that realization bothered him more than he cared to admit. It was as if he were facing a language he no longer knew how to decipher, the language of virtue. For years, Wallace believed that every human gesture had a price or a hidden intention. That belief had brought him success, but it had also stolen something essential: the ability to recognize purity when it presents itself without masks. And there she was, Clara, a woman invisible to society's eyes, showing him, without saying a word, that perhaps he had been wrong all along. Her honesty didn't scream, didn't demand, didn't justify itself. It simply existed, and in the face of that, Wallace felt small. Clara, meanwhile, returned home as she always did, surrounded by the noise of buses, silent thoughts, and the dignity of someone who moves through the day without lowering her head. But something felt different that day. She felt a kind of relief that didn't come only from the fact that her workday was over, but from something deeper, an intimate certainty that she had kept her integrity intact. When she arrived at the small house in the suburbs, she was greeted with joy by her children. Laura ran to hug her with a piece of paper in hand, a colorful drawing with crooked letters that read, "Mommy, you are my example." Pedro, the older one, was in the kitchen trying to cook rice to surprise her. Clara felt a lump in her throat. Life was hard, resources were scarce, but her home was built with love. As she put away the few items she had managed to buy, she thought about the choice she had made in front of that safe. She knew no one would ever know. No one would applaud her. No one would ever ask her what she saw or what she thought. But she knew. She knew how easy it would have been to pretend she hadn't seen anything and come back at night. She knew how much she needed the money. But more than that, she knew she needed to be an example. She needed to be a mirror for her children, that her peace had no price, and that her conscience was her last true possession. She had no idea that, at that very moment, someone far above her in social status, but so far below in terms of values, was slowly being rebuilt because of her. She might never come to know, but that didn't matter, because goodness for Clara didn't need an audience. It only needed to be done. And that is precisely why her soul was so rare. Wallace didn't sleep that night, and he didn't even try to pretend he could. The house was silent, as always, but something different lingered in the air, as if every wall were watching him, as if the furniture were judging him. He got up before dawn and, barefoot, walked down the long hallway that connected his bedroom to the library. The automated lights turned on as he passed, revealing rows of books he had collected but rarely read. He stopped in front of the central shelf, pulled out an old box, and inside it, he found a photo album covered in a thin layer of dust and unresolved memories. The pages creaked as they opened, revealing smiles frozen in time. A young Wallace with a sparkle in his eyes, his proud parents still alive, his younger sister laughing at a birthday party. And then, there she was, Helena, the woman he once believed would be his forever. That woman had changed his story in an irreversible way. Her betrayal didn't just destroy the relationship, it destroyed the man he used to be. Since then, Wallace had come to see the world through the lens of extreme caution. He preferred control over connection, logic over empathy. He involved himself in affectionless relationships, friendships with expiration dates, and decisions based on profit, not values. But now, a cleaning woman with worn hands and a serene gaze had lit a candle in the middle of the darkness he had created for himself. And that was, at the very least, unsettling. The next morning, Wallace woke up even before the alarm, as if a silent calling had pulled him out of bed. He dressed slowly, chose a simpler outfit, dismissed the driver, and drove himself to the house where Clara worked. Upon arrival, he asked the manager to let her leave early, with full pay for the day, without offering any explanations. The manager looked at him in surprise but didn't dare question him. Wallace wasn't exactly sure what he wanted to observe, whether it was her reaction, or simply the feeling of doing something unexpected without a logical reason. When Clara was called in and received the news, she was stunned. It was unusual. Her first instinct was fear. Was she being let go? Replaced by someone younger? Had she made a mistake without realizing it? But the manager's response was calm. "It's a thank you for your good work." That threw Clara off. She gave a quiet thank you, took off her apron carefully, washed her hands with soap, and dried them with the usual towel. On her way out, she looked back, as if to make sure she wasn't forgetting anything, or maybe, like someone saying goodbye to a day that had been kind. From the top of the second-floor balcony, Wallace was watching. He saw the simple woman leave the mansion as if she carried no burden on her shoulders. There was a lightness in her steps, a kind of peace he no longer recognized in himself. And in that silence, the millionaire understood that not all wealth can be measured in numbers. Clara walked to the bus stop as if stepping into a world that, for a moment, felt less hostile. The sky was blue, not just because of the weather, but because there was a deeper blue within her, born from the rare feeling of being seen. She sat on the wooden bench and watched the traffic, the rushed pedestrians, a mother pulling her child by the hand. Time seemed to slow down. Meanwhile, back at the office, Wallace was making a decision he himself couldn't fully justify. He called an old friend, a retired journalist who used to investigate major political scandals. He asked him to do a background check on Clara. "Nothing invasive. I just want to understand who she is, what she's lived, where she comes from," Wallace said, trying not to sound emotional. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't mere curiosity. It was a need. He needed to confirm that her honesty wasn't a fluke, a stroke of luck, or a performance. He wanted, or rather needed, to believe that goodness still existed in its pure, raw, unfiltered form. After hanging up the phone, he sat for long minutes, staring at an empty picture frame on his desk. He had never placed a photo there. He had never felt he had anything worth remembering tenderly. But now, thinking of Clara, he imagined that maybe it was time to start building something that couldn't be bought. For the first time in a long while, Wallace felt small in the face of a greatness that didn't come from power but from humility. The envelope arrived on a quiet afternoon, delivered by a discreet courier who simply nodded and walked away. Wallace held it in his hands for a few minutes before opening it, as if the contents might alter something irreversible inside him. He sat down in the dark leather armchair, pushed the phone aside, turned off the monitor, and was left with nothing but the sound of his own breathing. When he finally broke the seal, the smell of the paper and the texture of the documents felt denser than usual. It was the report, extensive, precise. In it, every fragment of Clara's life had been gathered with a cold objectivity that was impossible to ignore. Her parents, who died when she was still a teenager, victims of a drunk driver. Her two brothers, raised by her through superhuman effort, stretching rice to the last grain, sewing their school uniforms at night to save money. One of them was now studying nursing on a full scholarship. The other, a delivery driver, helped with the household bills. Clara, for her part, had spent the last 20 years cleaning houses, caring for the elderly, working silently, never having taken a vacation, never having complained, never having been noticed, and yet never once failing to smile at her children, or to prepare each meal with care, using whatever she had. Wallace read every line as if he were reading a sacred biography. There were no scandals, no missteps, only dignity, a silent, resilient dignity, lived at the base, where cameras don't reach, where spotlights don't shine. And he understood, with a lump in his throat, that he was standing before something money could never buy: character. Across the city, Clara was beginning yet another ordinary day, unaware that someone was rebuilding his worldview based on the story she carried in her body and soul. She woke before the sun, as always, with the alarm ringing beside the old radio. She rose gently so as not to wake her children. She made coffee, spread margarine on slices of bread, laid out the school uniforms on the kitchen chair, and left notes with hand-drawn hearts. It was her way of caring, even in absence. She left the house wearing the coat she had inherited from her mother, and on the crowded bus, she chose to stand so an elderly woman could sit. None of it seemed special to her. It was simply how you live when you're aware of the whole. Arriving at the house where she worked, she sensed something different in the air. Maybe it was the way the manager looked at her, or how her colleagues greeted her with more respect. Maybe it was herself standing taller, firmer. During cleaning, she hummed an old song softly, as if stitching peace into every corner. While organizing books, she recalled a memory from childhood. Her mother in a floral apron, cleaning the same way, always saying, "When you clean outside, you clean inside too." Clara believed in that, and she carried that belief into everything she touched. Her life was made of silence, but it was a silence that taught. Wallace watched her through the crack in the office door, not like a spy, but like a student. Every gesture of hers was a reminder of something he had lost, or maybe buried under layers of coldness and self-preservation. He saw when she paused for a moment to straighten a crooked picture on the wall. She could have ignored it. No one would notice, but she stopped, adjusted it carefully, took a step back, looked, smiled to herself, and moved on. That touched Wallace in a way he hadn't expected. How could someone find beauty even in what is crooked? How could someone care about details no one else sees? It was in that moment that he understood. Clara didn't live to be seen. She lived to be true. And perhaps that was what hurt him the most. Knowing that with all he possessed, with all the trips, cars, and gala dinners, he had never felt whole the way she seemed to be. She reminded him of the boy he once was, before the armor, before the wounds, before the greed. A boy who also wanted to fix what was broken in the world, but who, over time, grew tired, hardened, forgot. And there, in that cleaning woman who scrubbed with hands full of hope, Wallace rediscovered something he thought was lost forever: the desire to be a better man. Not out of vanity, not for others, but for himself. Wallace spent the following days immersed in a dense fog of thoughts and emotions that consumed him more than he cared to admit. It was as if an ancient part of himself, long buried beneath layers of distrust and self-protection, was slowly beginning to surface, searching for something he had long believed lost forever: faith in human goodness. Never before had he allowed someone so simple and seemingly distant to affect him so deeply, and this unexpected awakening stirred within him a disconcerting mix of vulnerability and hope. He, who had always controlled every detail of his life and business with an almost relentless rigidity, now felt his inner world tremble, as if an invisible bridge were being built between him and that woman whose silent presence had begun to echo in his heart. Wallace reflected on all the times he had ignored people like Clara, those who go unnoticed by society, underestimated by their appearance, yet who carry within them a quiet strength, a dignity that can't be seen, but can certainly be felt. He thought about the countless occasions when, out of fear or skepticism, he had chosen cynicism over empathy, judgment over compassion, mistrust over hope. And in the solitary stillness of his luxurious office, he made a silent promise: to tear down the barriers built by pain, loss, and fear, and to open his heart to the unexpected, to the possibility of redemption that can't be bought. He decided he wanted to know Clara not as an employee, nor as a distant character in his routine, but as a complete human being, with sorrows, dreams, and virtues he had forgotten even existed. Meanwhile, Clara continued her routine marked by daily challenges that, although often heavy, had never managed to extinguish the faint flame of hope she kept alive in her chest. The unexpected gift of that early time off, a subtle kindness that no grand gesture could replace, had planted within her a quiet and transformative seed of hope. It was a new and strange feeling for someone used to living on the margins of society, invisible to the eyes of the powerful and, many times, even to those around her. For Clara to be valued, even in a discreet and modest way, felt like a balm for a tired soul and a reaffirmation that her dignity was unshakable. Upon arriving home, she wrapped her children in warm hugs, feeling that despite the hardships and sleepless nights, there was something greater that transcended mere survival. A silent promise of better days, built not by chance but through the persistence of someone who never gave up on her principles. Clara knew that true transformation did not come from isolated gestures, occasional charity, or empty promises, but from fidelity to one's values, from unbreakable integrity even when no one is watching. It was this conviction that sustained her, that made her rise early and keep moving forward, step by step, with the certainty that her quiet efforts would one day make a difference. Not only for herself but for those she loved and for the world around her. The invisible and still unspoken connection between Wallace and Clara began to grow stronger, though neither of them was fully aware of it. Each, in their own way and at their own pace, was taking firm steps toward a profound change that surpassed the boundaries of money, power, and superficial appearances. Wallace began to understand that true value does not lie in possessions or social status, but in what can be shared genuinely: mutual trust, quiet respect, and sincere compassion. Clara, for her part, felt that her daily choices, however humble they might seem to the world, had an impact that went far beyond the visible, reverberating through lives and hearts in ways she could never imagine. This quiet and delicate relationship, built not with words or promises, but with small gestures, glances, and attitudes, represented the beginning of a journey capable of forever transforming both of their lives. Wallace was no longer the isolated and distrustful millionaire shaped by past wounds. Clara was no longer just the dedicated and invisible housekeeper marked by struggle and courage. They were rediscovering themselves as human beings in the process of healing, learning, and renewal. And in that silent vastness, full of meaning and hope, they found proof that true kindness, authenticity, and humanity can bloom even in the most unexpected and unlikely places. Wallace woke up that morning with a different weight on his chest, a weight he couldn't ignore, though he wished he could return to his usual routine of control and indifference. It wasn't the cold weight of emotional detachment he had cultivated for years, but something more complex, a mix of restlessness and hope that brought about an unexpected discomfort. The image of Clara, that simple and resilient woman, remained vivid in his mind like a flame that could not be extinguished. He found himself forced to face a truth he had been avoiding for a long time. The fortress built around his pain, mistrust, and fear was beginning to crumble in the face of the silent honesty of a woman he barely knew. For years, Wallace had isolated himself, allowing the wounds of the past to turn him into a man disconnected from vulnerability and true human connection. However, in that moment, he realized that real strength didn't lie in distance or rigid control, but in the courage to open his heart and allow himself to feel, even knowing it could lead to pain. He decided, then, that he needed to truly know Clara, not as a passing curiosity or a distant figure, but as someone with her own story, full of dreams, pain, and virtues. Someone as human as himself. This realization made him see that, despite all the wealth and power he had accumulated, he was a lonely man, and that empathy, respect, and understanding would be the first steps toward rebuilding broken ties and reclaiming the humanity he had lost. He felt himself in the midst of an internal awakening, a genuine desire for change and healing that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, Clara continued her routine with the same quiet determination that defined her, facing daily challenges with a resilience only the strongest can sustain. Yet something inside her was beginning to shift, even if still subtle and not fully conscious. The unexpected attention from Wallace, though discreet and restrained, had awakened in her a new sense of worth, a recognition that went beyond mere payment for her labor. For someone who had spent her entire life being invisible, ignored, or underestimated, this change, however small, brought a deep comfort, a seed of hope carefully planted in her tired heart. When she arrived home at the end of the day, Clara wrapped her children in tight hugs, finding in those simple, genuine gestures an immense strength to keep fighting against adversity. Even in the face of sleepless nights and financial hardship, there was a silent promise that her life could be different, not built on luck or charity, but on the persistence of her values and the dignity that refused to be erased. Clara understood that true transformation did not come from isolated acts, but from daily faithfulness to the principles that kept her grounded, even when no one was watching. It was this unwavering conviction that gave her the courage to rise early and press on, step by step, with the hope that her quiet efforts would one day make a real difference, not just in her life, but in the lives of those she loved and in the community around her. The invisible and still unspoken connection between Wallace and Clara was beginning to grow stronger, gaining layers of depth and complexity that surprised them both, even if they couldn't express it in words. Each small gesture, each fleeting glance, carried an emotional weight that quietly built a bridge between them, connecting them in a way that transcended the barriers of money, power, and superficial appearances that had long defined their lives. Wallace began to question not only himself but also the system that allowed people like Clara to remain invisible, ignored, and underestimated, despite being the silent foundation that sustained society. He felt a growing urgency to act, not to accumulate more material possessions or reinforce his status, but to use his resources and influence to create a real, tangible, and lasting impact on the lives of those who live in the shadows unseen by most. Clara, in turn, though still carrying a healthy dose of caution, began to realize that her existence and her daily choices held deep value, resonating in lives and hearts in ways she had never imagined. Through this silent relationship, built with humility, respect, and genuine human connection, both were beginning a journey of healing and transformation that transcended prejudice, past wounds, and social limitations. They were discovering together that true wealth is not found in possessions, but in the ability to connect with another person's essence, to allow oneself to be vulnerable, and above all, to be transformed by that connection. It was an invitation to rewrite their stories, to rebuild themselves, and to find each other on a new path, one full of hope and humanity. Wallace increasingly felt the weight of the past on his shoulders, an invisible burden that suffocated him and kept him from moving forward in life as he wished. He, who had always taken pride in the absolute control he exerted over himself and his empire, was now facing an internal battle that no amount of money could resolve. The pain of Helena's betrayal, which once seemed like an eternal wound, was beginning to reveal itself not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a shadow that needed to be faced in order to be overcome. It was a challenge that went far beyond resentment. It was the challenge of forgiveness, forgiving others, but also, and most importantly, forgiving himself for the failures, the fears, and the bitterness he had carried. Wallace came to understand, in deep moments of solitary reflection, that his emotional rigidity, his mistrust, and his fear had been walls built to protect him from a vulnerability he had always feared to show. Yet those walls that once gave him a sense of safety were now becoming prisons that kept him distant from people, from life, and from his own happiness. He realized that forgiveness didn't mean erasing or minimizing the painful past, but freeing himself from the emotional prison that prevented him from loving and living fully. This inner awakening was painful, like tearing out an old wound, but also profoundly liberating, because for the first time in many years, Wallace felt he could rebuild his life and relationships from a new foundation. Genuine love, self-acceptance, and the courage to open himself to the possibility of a different, less fearful, and more human future. Meanwhile, Clara continued her daily routine, marked by sacrifice, responsibility, and a resilience that only the strongest can sustain without breaking. Yet, there was a quiet transformation taking place within her, a gradual and subtle growth, almost imperceptible, but one that deeply changed the way she saw the world and herself. Wallace's discreet attention, though still subtle and without explicit words, had planted in her a seed of hope, a recognition that went far beyond mere payment for her labor. For Clara, who had spent her entire life being invisible, underestimated, even ignored, that feeling of being valued was a balm for a tired soul and confirmation that her dignity could never be denied. When she arrived home at night, she wrapped her children in long, tight hugs, finding in those simple gestures the strength she needed to keep facing the adversities that insisted on showing up. Even in the face of sleepless nights, overdue bills, and constant worries, Clara held tightly to the silent promise that her life could be different. Not through luck or charity, but through persistence in upholding her values and unwavering faith in the justice of life. She knew that true transformation would not come through miracles or isolated grand gestures, but through daily faithfulness to her principles, through the courage that got her out of bed every morning to face the day, and through her silent commitment to building a dignified future for herself and her children, even when no one was watching. The invisible connection forming between Wallace and Clara was gaining strength and complexity, even though neither of them was fully aware of the impact that this silent relationship was already having on their lives. Each small gesture, each fleeting glance, carried deep meaning and built a bridge of respect, empathy, and humanity that transcended the barriers of money, power, and the social differences that separated them. Wallace began to question not only his own actions and prejudices, but also the entire system that allowed people like Clara to remain invisible, ignored, and underestimated, while they sustained the social machine through their hard work and silent dedication. He felt a genuine urgency growing within him to act, not to increase his wealth or social influence, but to use his resources in meaningful ways, creating real and lasting opportunities for those who, like Clara, fought to survive with dignity. Clara, though still maintaining a healthy dose of caution, began to realize that her existence and daily choices had a value that transcended the visible, reverberating in lives and hearts in ways she could never have imagined. Through this relationship built on humility, respect, and authenticity, they were taking the first steps on a journey of healing, transformation, and redemption. A journey that invited them to rewrite their stories, to overcome their fears, and to rediscover themselves in their shared humanity. Together, they were learning that true wealth is not found in material possessions, but in the ability to deeply connect with another person, to allow oneself to be vulnerable, and above all, to be transformed by that connection. A life lesson that would forever change their paths. Wallace felt, for the first time in many years, that something within him was beginning to change in a definitive way. A change that went far beyond the shallow reflections he was used to having. The silent connection with Clara, which initially seemed like nothing more than a passing moment of curiosity or compassion, had turned into a deep invitation to an internal revolution that challenged all of his old emotional patterns. He realized that true strength, contrary to what he had always believed, didn't lie in the accumulation of wealth or the rigid control he exercised over every aspect of his life, but in the genuine courage to recognize his own fragilities, to accept his emotions, and to allow himself to be vulnerable and human. This process of transformation was neither simple nor comfortable. There was a massive internal resistance, built over decades of self-protection, deeply rooted fears, and a personal history marked by deep disappointments and unresolved traumas. Still, Wallace found in Clara an unexpected mirror. Not a mirror that reflected his weaknesses, but one that revealed his capacity for resilience and renewed hope. The woman he once viewed as a mere employee had become, to him, an inexhaustible source of inspiration, a living example of silent courage that stood strong in the face of despair and daily adversity. From that moment on, he began to seriously question what truly mattered in life, what legacy he wanted to leave behind beyond material possessions, and how he wished to be remembered. It was an awakening that made him see the world with new eyes. Eyes that were more sensitive, generous, and capable of understanding the true value of human connection. On the other hand, Clara was also experiencing profound changes brought about by that subtle and transformative relationship, even though she maintained her humble character and natural caution in the face of new situations. She began to realize that her presence, her choices, and her integrity were being seen and appreciated in ways she never thought possible, especially by someone so distant from her reality and social status as Wallace. The growing attention, though discreet and respectful, from the millionaire brought her a new dimension of hope, a feeling that her existence would no longer be an invisible and lonely struggle against everyday hardships. She began to nurture dreams, not illusions or fantasies, but real, attainable dreams of a better future for her children and for herself. This inner transformation did not come as the result of luck or temporary charity, but as a natural consequence of a shift in perspective. One that allowed her to see that her dignity, honesty, and values had a real and profound impact, capable of touching and inspiring even those who seemed so far removed from her world. This new awareness further strengthened Clara, giving her the energy to continue facing life's difficulties with the certainty that every act of honesty, every silent sacrifice, was building a path of growth and respect that could open doors to a better, fairer future. She began to realize that, without drawing attention to herself, She was becoming a beacon of integrity and hope, not only for her family but for her entire community. As Wallace and Clara's relationship progressed, they began to realize that their lives, once distant and isolated in their respective realities, were becoming deeply and unexpectedly intertwined, creating a new narrative that challenged both social conventions and their own emotional limitations. Wallace, the millionaire who for years had shut himself off from the world and from people, was now opening himself to the possibility of real, sincere connections rooted in empathy and mutual respect. Clara, the woman who had always lived on the margins of society and opportunity, was beginning to see her own strength reflected in the eyes of a man who recognized her not just as an employee, but as a person, someone worthy of respect, dignity, and consideration. Together, they were building a delicate, invisible bridge, one made of small gestures, meaningful glances, and genuine acts that transcended the power of money and the weight of the social differences that had long separated them. This quiet and powerful transformation invited them to rethink their lives, to abandon prejudices, to heal old wounds, and to embrace humanity in its purest, most vulnerable, and most authentic form. Wallace and Clara were finally discovering that the true meaning of life lies in the ability to love, to forgive, and to allow oneself to be touched by another. A simple lesson, yet one powerful enough to change destinies, heal deep wounds, and give purpose to a life that once seemed marked by loneliness and fear. The decisive moment arrived almost imperceptibly, a silent and nearly invisible breath that nonetheless carried immense weight of meaning for both. Wallace, who for a long time had seen Clara merely as one employee among many, discovered that true wealth had never been in the cold figures of his safe, but rather in the genuine trust, mutual respect, and humanity that woman taught him every day through her upright conduct, humble silence, and generous heart. At that specific instant, upon finding the safe open, Wallace did not feel fear or anger, as he might have expected. Instead, a deep admiration took hold of him, a feeling of reverence for the choice Clara had made in that moment. She could have walked away with an immeasurable treasure, but chose not to touch anything that didn't belong to her, respecting boundaries that go far beyond money. That simple and silent gesture, yet loaded with immeasurable honesty, was living proof that human dignity is not something that can be bought, sold, or negotiated, and that a person's true character is revealed in the small decisions made when no one is watching, in moments when the temptation to break rules might exist, but integrity prevails. Wallace then realized that his test had been brilliantly and honestly passed, and that he was in the presence of a woman whose worth far exceeded any material wealth. This revelation not only changed his perception of Clara, but also forced him to look at himself with more critical and compassionate eyes, and to question the world he had built around himself, founded on fear and distrust. He finally understood that trust is the solid foundation of any true relationship, and that only those who possess genuine integrity are capable of honoring and preserving this sacred feeling. Clara, for her part, experienced a deep and unexpected sense of recognition she had never imagined possible. The respect Wallace offered her did not come with grand words or ostentatious gestures, but rather with actions that demonstrated true and profound trust, a wholehearted acceptance of the person she was, with all her stories, virtues, and scars. This experience brought Clara renewed strength and an even greater conviction that honesty and perseverance, even in the face of the greatest adversities, build an invisible and invincible strength capable of transforming lives and inspiring people, even those who seem distant or disconnected. She learned that dignity is an inalienable heritage that no power or circumstance can take away, and that true victory lies in remaining faithful to one's values, even when the world seems to conspire against it. This life lesson strengthened her to continue her journey with an expanded sense of purpose and pride, knowing that her story, full of challenges and sacrifices, is an inexhaustible source of inspiration and a powerful reminder that every person deserves to be treated with respect and humanity, regardless of their social position, history, or hardships faced. In the silence of that final encounter, Wallace and Clara shared something far greater than words could express. A deep and silent understanding that the true value of people does not lie in the possessions they accumulate, but in the character, empathy, compassion, and mutual respect they cultivate in their hearts. This experience, which might seem simple to an outsider, proved to be a powerful and transformative lesson for both, showing that life's most precious riches are not those kept in safes or displayed in titles, but those built with love, trust, and daily integrity. Their story is an invitation for all to reflect on how they treat others, on the importance of cultivating genuine kindness even in the smallest everyday gestures, and on the transformative power of faith in humanity, which can always be reborn, even in the most unexpected and difficult circumstances. Together, Wallace and Clara proved that when we choose to act with dignity, respect, and compassion, we create invisible bridges capable of overcoming social barriers, healing old wounds, and opening paths toward a more just, more humane, and hopeful future. This lesson, full of eternal values and principles, remains a legacy that inspires and moves us, reminding us that true greatness lies in the ability to love, forgive, and respect others, always under any circumstance and regardless of the past we carry.